Imagine you are standing at one end of a bridge. A person is about to step onto it. You know something they don't. The bridge is unsafe. What do? Do you stop them? It seems simple. Of course you do. You have a duty. But what if they insist? What if they tell you they understand the risks and wish to cross anyway? Do you physically restrain them? What if they don't believe you? What if they think you are lying to them for your own reasons? This dilemma, known as the harm principle, was famously formulated by John Stuart Mill. Mill argued that the sole end for which society is warranted in interfering with an individual's liberty of action is self-protection. Philosopher Joel Feinberg later expanded this by distinguishing between harm as a setback to interest, a non-normative sense of harm, and harm as a wrong, a normative sense of harm. Feinberg argued that the act of stopping someone about to cross a dangerous bridge can be construed as an act of paternalism, an interference with another person's liberty, justified by reasons referring exclusively to the welfare of the person being coerced. In the moment of decision, you act because you believe you know better what is good for them than they do. This episode is about that bridge. It's about the instinct to protect, and the point at which that instinct might curdle into something else. When does our impulse to protect others, especially the vulnerable, cross the line from a duty of care into an act that forecloses their future? When does saving them from a perceived danger today trap them in a smaller world tomorrow? For centuries, the doctor was a figure of almost unimpeachable authority, a custodian of life's greatest mysteries. Medicine was not merely a job, but a calling, a sacred profession whose practitioners were worthy of society's deepest trust and respect. This perception, rooted in a historical ideal, formed the very bedrock of the doctor-patient relationship. It was a covenant built on faith in the physician's singular expertise and benevolent intent, a foundation that for generations seemed as solid as stone, but has in our time begun to show deep and unsettling cracks. This historical ideal was codified in an ethical framework of medical paternalism, a social compact where the physician's authority was understood to be absolute. Early ethical codes, from Percival's foundational work to the first principles of the American Medical Association, stipulated a clear hierarchy. The AMA's code outlined reciprocal duties, but the power dynamic was unambiguous. While physicians were obligated to obey the calls of the sick, the patient's role was one of prompt and implicit obedience. Patients were expected to accept their physician's superior knowledge and were explicitly cautioned that they should never permit their own crude opinions as to their fitness to influence his attention to them. The consequence of this model was a relationship in which the physician was viewed as the sole, technically competent authority. In this dynamic, the patient was a layman whose role was to receive care, not to question it. As one analysis described it, the physician's judgments cannot be competently judged by the layman, who must therefore take them simply on authority. This was not seen as a failure of the system, but as its defining strength, a clear and orderly exchange where specialized knowledge was entrusted to guide the vulnerable back to health. Yet this seemingly unshakable model of authority, which defined medicine for so long, could not remain isolated from the social and ethical shifts occurring in the world around it. The quiet deference of the examination room was destined to be disrupted by a rising chorus of new voices demanding answers, accountability, and a share of the power that had for so long been held by the physician alone. Despite living in an age of medical miracles, we face this existential, ethical paradox. The system designed to heal has become a leading cause of harm. This isn't a rare accident or the fault of a few bad doctors. This is a systemic crisis, an architecture of harm built on a foundation of misaligned incentives, corporate greed, and a deep cultural dependency. The term for this is iatrogenesis, harm caused by the healer. And today, we're going to dissect it. We're not here to blame the dedicated clinicians on the front lines, but to investigate the structural crisis that traps them and their patients in a self-reinforcing cycle of failure. This is a story about how the medical industrial complex has captured our regulators, corrupted our science, and fundamentally changed our relationship with pain, sickness, and even death itself. The cultural shift away from unquestioning faith in medicine is not a single seismic event, but a slow, dawning realization that the system is fallible and at times tragically so. An era of critical public scrutiny has begun to replace the old reverence as the public grows more willing to question official medical narratives. This new skepticism has found a focus in the emerging field of patient safety, as alarming statistics begin to suggest that the institutions designed to heal are also a significant source of harm. First, to understand how we got here, we must examine the three layers of medical harm and expose the corporate engine that drives it. Our reference for understanding this will be the work of the visionary social critic Ivan Illich, who saw this crisis unfolding decades ago and gave us the language to describe it. Long before it became a headline statistic, Ivan Illich diagnosed the sickness within our healthcare system. He argued that medical harm wasn't just a matter of botched surgeries or incorrect prescriptions. Instead, he identified three interconnected categories of iatrogenesis: clinical, social, and cultural, that work together to create what he called the medical nemesis, a powerful system that ultimately makes society sicker. First, there is the harm we can see and measure: clinical iatrogenesis. This is the direct physical damage inflicted by medical treatments, the toxic side effects, the unsafe procedures, the deadly mistakes. The scale of this problem is staggering. A 2016 Johns Hopkins study reported that over 251,000 patient deaths annually were linked to preventable medical mistakes, placing it third in the U.S. after only heart disease and cancer. Another paper from 2013 suggested the number could be as high as 440,000. This epidemic of error is not one single failure, but a cascade of them. It's the misdiagnosis that sends a patient down the wrong treatment path, the surgical complication like a wrong side operation or anesthesia miscalculation, and the medication mistake that delivers a fatal dose. It's the hospital-acquired infection, a leading cause of in-hospital death, that thrives due to poor sanitation and the overuse of antibiotics, which breeds resistant superbugs. This cycle is further accelerated by the practice of defensive medicine, where doctors, fearing lawsuits, order a battery of risky and unnecessary tests and treatments, each carrying its own potential for harm. The most tragic part? This carnage is often invisible, as death certificates rarely list medical error, opting instead for the underlying disease to satisfy outdated and inefficient billing codes. Beyond the direct physical harm lies a more subtle but equally damaging form of injury: social iatrogenesis. This is the process by which the medical system relentlessly expands its authority, turning normal human experiences into diseases that require professional management. Grief, aging, anxiety, shyness. These are no longer seen as parts of the human condition, but as pathologies to be diagnosed and treated. In this paradigm, medicine functions as a powerful tool of social control, defining what is normal and pathologizing any deviation from it. The pharmaceutical industry is the primary engine of this medicalization. It aggressively markets expensive drugs for non-diseases, creating a society dependent on its products for managing the challenges of everyday life. This has two devastating effects. First, it creates a population of addicts, both those prescribed drugs for lifestyle management and those who then suffer from the inevitable side effects. Second, by framing these social issues as medical problems, the system drains immense resources away from the things that actually determine public health: proper nutrition, stable housing, clean environments, and education. We pour billions into managing symptoms while ignoring the root causes of suffering. The third and most profound level of harm is cultural iatrogenesis. This is the destruction of our autonomous ability to cope with pain, sickness, and death. Modern medicine has fostered a culture that cannot tolerate suffering. It is no longer seen as an inevitable part of life that can build resilience and character, but as a technical problem that must be eliminated at all costs. This cultural shift saps our will to face our own reality, creating a mass denial of mortality. The natural process of dying is hijacked, replaced by what Illich called antiseptic, medicalized terminal ceremonies, where patients and families are supervised by professionals who operate beyond criticism. By teaching us to run to a clinic for every minor discomfort, The system cultivates a state of pathetic dependency. It systematically expropriates our health, stripping us of our capacity for self-care and mutual aid. In this world, health is no longer something we do, it is something we get. These three forms of iatrogenesis, clinical, social, and cultural, are not separate. They are a single powerful system. Clinical harm creates the patient, social harm defines their life as a treatable condition, and cultural harm makes them a willing participant in their own dependency. Each layer reinforces the others. If iatrogenesis is the what, then the medical industrial complex is the why. The erosion of trust in medicine extends far beyond individual mistakes, or the philosophical tension between paternalism and autonomy. It is deeply rooted in the systemic and financial architecture of modern healthcare, where a system of private ordering has emerged in which corporate priorities often play a more decisive role than public good or scientific evidence. This corporate-dominated system, where profit motives have become dangerously entangled with public health, is the engine driving these failures. And that engine is supported by a key load-bearing pillar in the architecture of harm: the capture of the very agencies meant to hold it accountable. This concept is called regulatory capture. It's what happens when a government agency created to serve the public interest ends up serving the interests of the industry it's supposed to regulate. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is a textbook case. This capture isn't accomplished through a single bribe, but through a web of systemic collusion. First, there is financial interdependence. Thanks to the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA, the pharmaceutical industry now funds nearly half of the FDA's total budget and 2/3 of its drug review program. The regulator has, in effect, become a client of the regulated. Second, there is overwhelming lobbying power. The pharmaceutical industry has spent over $2 billion lobbying Congress in the last decade alone. The return on that investment is staggering. For an individual firm, research suggests that the market value contribution of an additional dollar of lobbying is roughly $200. And third, there is the corrupting influence of the revolving door. A shocking number of FDA officials who approve drugs leave their government posts for lucrative executive jobs in the very pharmaceutical companies they once oversaw. This creates a powerful incentive for regulators to make life easier for their potential future employers. The result of this captured system is a market flooded with drugs that are often unsafe or barely effective. The story of Vioxx is a chilling case study. Internal research had identified the drug's deadly cardiac risks, but it was pushed through the approval process anyway. Before it was recalled, it caused or contributed to hundreds of thousands of deaths. This was not an isolated incident. The opioid crisis, which has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, was fueled by the FDA's failure to enforce marketing regulations and demand adequate long-term safety trials from companies that deceptively promoted opioids for chronic pain. These are not accidents. They are the predictable and tragic outcomes of a system where public safety has been subordinated to private profit. This pattern of misconduct is alarmingly consistent. Drug companies systematically concealed the risk of suicidal thoughts associated with SSRI antidepressants, recategorizing these adverse events as mere emotional lability in their trial data. In another bid for regulatory approval, companies have been caught manipulating their data by adding suicide attempts that occurred before randomization to the placebo group's results, but not to the drug groups, creating a false impression of safety. Perhaps most brazenly, a pharmaceutical executive admitted to identifying a key Swedish expert tasked with reviewing a new antidepressant and, after being told the drug's data was laughable, paid the expert what amounted to a bribe to falsify the registration application for approval. As the executive later noted, this is how the mob operates when it orders a murder. The systemic consequences of this corporate capture are catastrophic. Companies consistently fail to release their raw trial data for independent scrutiny, preventing the broader scientific community from verifying their claims. As a result, widespread medical practices are often justified by flawed, biased, or even fraudulent studies. This dynamic has had a devastating impact on public trust. In 2015, Richard Horton, the editor of the prestigious medical journal The Lancet, issued a sobering warning that science has taken a turn towards darkness. He amplified the conclusion of others that a significant portion, perhaps even half, of the published medical literature may simply be untrue. This toxic environment, saturated with scientific uncertainty and deep-seated distrust, creates the perfect conditions for intractable social conflicts to erupt over the very nature of medicine itself. To further see this system's flaws in action, we need only look at the world of modern oncology. The relentless pressure for profit and faster approvals has fundamentally corrupted the scientific standards we use to determine if a cancer drug actually works, creating a world of false hope and real harm. In medicine, the gold standard for measuring a drug's success has always been overall survival. Does the drug help a patient live longer? It's a simple, unambiguous question. But measuring overall survival takes time, and time is money. So the industry has increasingly relied on surrogate endpoints, indirect measures that are thought to predict survival but often don't. A common surrogate is progression-free survival, which measures how long it takes for a tumor to grow on a scan. A drug might successfully shrink a tumor or delay its growth for a few months, a positive result for a surrogate endpoint. But what good is that if the patient doesn't actually live any longer or feel any better? The connection between these surrogates and actual survival is often shockingly weak. For certain immunotherapy combinations, the statistical correlation between a surrogate endpoint and living longer is as low as 0.01 to 0.22, meaning it's practically non-existent. The system is measuring the wrong thing, celebrating statistical victories that have no meaning for the patient. This reliance on shaky science is institutionalized through the FDA's accelerated approval pathway, which allows drugs onto the market based on these unvalidated surrogates. The companies promise to conduct follow-up studies to prove a real clinical benefit later. The problem is they often don't. One study reviewing cancer drugs granted accelerated approval found that after more than 5 years of follow-up, 41% of them had failed to show any improvement in survival or quality of life. Patients are exposed to toxic, debilitating, and incredibly expensive treatments that offer no real benefit. And even when post-market studies prove a drug is ineffective, regulators often fail to pull it from the market, allowing it to remain the standard of care. This isn't just a clinical failure, it is an epistemological crisis at the very heart of the medical establishment. This architecture of harm is not held up by corporate and regulatory failure alone. It stands on two other powerful pillars: the professional indoctrination of clinicians and the cultural conditioning of society at large. Medical education, for all its rigor, often trains clinicians in cookbook medicine, using rigid protocols and algorithm as the blueprints used to construct professional conformity. This fosters a narrow framework that marginalizes a patient's lived experience. The system can create professionals with a heightened sense of self-importance, who see the patient not as a partner, but as a problem to be solved according to a pre-written recipe. This training reinforces a deeply ingrained culture of scientistic medical paternalism. Its roots run deep. The 1847 AMA Code of Ethics demanded that a patient's obedience to their doctor be prompt and implicit. While we now have the concept of informed consent, it is often treated as little more than a liability waiver, a form to sign, not a conversation to be had. This paternalism strips patients of their autonomy, justifying the override of their decisions in the name of their best interest, an interest often distorted by systemic biases. At the same time, society is conditioned to accept this system as infallible. Through relentless advertising and media repetition, we are brought into a state of hypernormalization, where the idea of medication as the default response to any discomfort becomes unquestioned common sense. Medicating has become a social custom. This cultural conditioning creates a pharmaceutical invasion and actively suppresses alternatives. Healing methods that fall outside the dominant biomedical model are systematically dismissed by the medical establishment as unscientific. This dominant model is often called allopathic medicine, a term ironically first used by its rivals in the 19th century to describe its practice of treating symptoms with opposites. By cementing this approach as the default, all other complete systems of healing are relegated to alternative status, ensuring that the public remains a willing participant in the expropriation of its own health. The picture we've painted is bleak, but the story doesn't end here. The growing public skepticism toward institutional medicine is not an irrational rejection of science. It is a deeply justified response to a corrupted and failing system. That skepticism is the first sign of a necessary paradigm shift. The first step toward healing the system is to restore moral agency to its practitioners. This is the capacity for healthcare professionals to provide ethical, compassionate care, even when facing immense institutional and economic pressure to do otherwise. This requires a fundamental shift in leadership, away from a transactional model that rewards protocol adherence and toward a transformational one. Leaders in medicine must be empowered to question assumptions, foster ethical reflection, and prioritize human-centered goals over business principles. Ultimately, the solution is not just better science or regulation. Following Illich, we must recognize that true health is not the absence of disease, but the autonomous capacity to cope with the human realities of pain, sickness, and death. It is resilience, it is strength, it is dignity. The ethical and political task ahead is enormous. It is nothing less than the careful dismantling of the architecture of Iatrogenesis, and it must be built upon 4 concrete pillars of reformation. First, regulatory decoupling to sever the financial ties between industry and its watchdogs. Second, evidence-based integrity to demand science that serves patients, not shareholders, by focusing on real survival and quality of life. Third, pedagogical transformation to train clinicians who value patient autonomy over rigid algorithms. And fourth, cultural reclaiming to foster a society that reclaims health as a personal and community responsibility, not a commodity to be purchased. Only then can we restore dignity and genuine healing to the practice of medicine.